Hargreaves, by profession and temperament, was a man defined by surety. For 20 years, his life had been built on the solid ground of survey markers, geodetic grids, and the immutable laws of two-dimensional representation. His world maintained hard borders, measured in acres and yards, governed by the cold elegance of the United States Geological Survey's nomenclature. Following the department cuts, a quiet surgical excision of superfluous personnel disguised as efficiency, he found himself marooned in a rented house outside of Millbrook, Maine, a place that smelled permanently of old turpentine and stale percolated coffee. The absence of routine left him floating, anchored only by his massive collection of outdated maps. It was the smell of the maps he craved most now, the desiccated scent of old maple cellulose and the metallic tang of lithographic ink. He sat at his kitchen table, which was buried under a stratified archaeological dig of paper, topographical plans dating back to 1910, overlaid with aerial reconnaissance shots from the 1980s, all competing with fresh printouts from his decommissioned computer-aided design machine. He sought pattern in layers of time. On one of the oldest sheets, brittle and foxed brown at the edges, where the survey lines met at the intersection of grids 82 and 83, he found it. A faint dotted line, barely thicker than a spider's silk, traversed a section marked simply as impassable timber. This line, a testament to someone's physical passage a century before, had been rubbed out of every subsequent record. It was marked in elegant copperplate script as the Minor Fox Path. The path was drawn as a slender, winding artery leading deep into the central forest mass. Locally, the people who lived around Millbrook, hard, quiet folks whose families had worked the lumber mills and slate quarries for generations, did not call that area the woods. They called it the woods. Capital W, pronounced with a specific low gravity that implied a presence, a singular, autonomous entity possessing name and will. Matt cataloged such rural anthropomorphism under regional superstition, low threat. His rational mind recoiled at the discrepancy. He began the meticulous process of superimposing the vintage data onto his current satellite imagery, a task that demanded precision, a task he missed bitterly. The dotted line cut straight into a massive, featureless green square on the digital projection, an absolute blank, designated only by the Contemporary Forestry Service as no vehicle access, deep canopy. There was nothing there. No logging roads, no transmission lines, no fire breaks, nothing that spoke of human intervention since the turn of the last century. The sheer irrationality of the blankness irritated Matt like a grain of sand jammed deep in a complex machine. The road, a forgotten timber route, had ceased to exist on every subsequent record for 50 years, yet it remained faintly inscribed on the geological memory of the region. Matt knew this was a profound error. This was not about fame or even money. He lived off a meager severance package. This was pure, dry, professional curiosity. The path, that forgotten scratch on the earth, had become a challenge. Matt sought an error in the system of the world, and as a man whose life had been dedicated to mapping reality, he felt compelled to find, fix, and officially record that error. He would walk the forgotten line. His preparation was not panicked. It was methodical, liturgical. He laid out his gear on the dining room table, arranging the items with the military precision learned during his years of field work. The drone, a high-end surveillance model adapted for civilian use, with 3 spare battery packs sealed in waterproof containers. The high-precision global positioning system unit, calibrated to within 4 inches of accuracy. The satellite telephone checked and rechecked for signal integrity. The heavy, reliable compass his father had given him nested in its brass casing, and his old, trusty hunting knife, a single piece of cold blue steel, sharp enough to shave with, strapped into its leather sheath. Matt was a rationalist to the bone, gearing up not for an adventure, but for a logical, prolonged reconnaissance mission. That night, the silence in Millbrook was dense. Not merely the absence of noise, but an active, viscous absorption of sound. It pressed against the eardrums, creating a faint, internal hum. He tried to read a paperback, a dry thriller about global logistics, but the heavy acoustic quality of the air made his skin prickle. It was a vacuum, a spatial distortion, settling over the land like a damp blanket. Matt, ever the pragmatist, ascribed the sensation to pre-expedition stress and the last cup of stale black coffee. He convinced himself that the woods were just woods, a complex system of organic matter, nothing more. The next morning, the summer sun already baked the dew off the cracked asphalt when Matt drove his old sport utility vehicle to the coordinates where his map indicated the path began. The location was unremarkable, a broken slice of abandoned logging road, terminating abruptly at a barricade of dense, untended second-growth timber. The air hit him immediately. A thick, suffocating wave of damp pine needles and the sweet, cloying decay of wet moss. It smelled primeval, untouched by asphalt or diesel smoke. He parked 50 yards back, where the asphalt was still relatively intact, and began his final checks. As he stepped out of the truck, strapping the heavy pack to his back, he looked into the wall of green. The trees here were packed so tightly, their branches interlocked like the fists of giants, that they created a permanent twilight beneath the canopy. There was no visible trace of a road, just the overwhelming, wet greenness. Matt's rational mind demanded a trail, a logical starting point. The deeper, more primal part of him felt a tremor of pure, sharp dread. He pulled the map from his protective sleeve, grid 8-2. The line began right here. He clipped the compass to his breast pocket, checked the global positioning system one last time, fully charged, locked on a dozen satellites, and stepped across the line of demarcation. The moment his boots sank into the damp earth, the familiar sounds of the modern world, the distant drone of a car on the highway, the faint buzz of insects near the pavement, dropped away. Matt stepped into the woods, and the woods immediately claimed him. His journey had begun, founded on a forgotten line in the dry ink of history. He took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the rank, heavy air. It felt less like walking into a forest and more like plunging into a body of water, dense and cold. He pushed aside a curtain of tangled blackberry vines and began the tedious work of bushwhacking, trusting the faint coordinates on his century-old map over the evidence of his own eyes. The map, he thought, was reality. He would prove it. He did not yet realize that the map told him about a reality the world had already forgotten how to see. Before driving out, Matt had sought one last anchor in the world he understood. He pulled his truck up outside the Three Pines Tavern, a local establishment that had stopped updating its decor, its menu, and its clientele sometime around the Great Depression. The air inside was thick with the scent of spilled cheap beer, stale cigarette smoke, and the faint, enduring aroma of pine cleaner that never quite won the battle against the former two. The lights were low, yellow, and unforgiving. At the end of the bar sat Harold Murr, a former state parks ranger well past 70, whose skin looked like cured leather pulled tight over bone. Matt ordered a domestic lager, the cheapest available, and casually brought up his expedition. Going in deep, huh? Harold's voice was a low, rusty croak, like a hinge that had not been oiled since the 1960s. He slowly polished the wet rim of a tumbler with a practiced thumb, his movements economical and old. Matt, trying to sound purely professional, spread a section of his topographical printout on the scarred mahogany surface. He pointed to the faint dotted line. "I found this anomaly, Harold. The Minor Fox Path. It should lead to some old abandoned mine shafts. I'm going to geotag it and update the departmental records." Harold did not look at the map. He kept his gaze fixed on the tumbler, turning it slowly. "All paths, boy," he finally rasped, his eyes still downcast. "All paths in those places eventually lead to the one road, and you don't walk that road if you plan on coming back." Matt felt the familiar rush of intellectual superiority fighting against a sudden, inexplicable chill. "That's just folklore, Harold. Bad luck stories." The old man finally looked up. His eyes, usually a dull, watery gray, gathered the dim bar light and reflected it back, momentarily flashing a piercing, ice-cold blue. The effect was immediate and unnerving, like seeing a predator's eyes flash in the beam of a headlight. "It ain't folklore, Matt. It's history that decided to stop being written down." Harold pushed the tumbler away, leaving a perfect wet circle on the bar. He began to talk about a road crew. This had been 40 years ago, before Matt had even left college. 12 men, all locals, were hired by a small timber consortium to restore a critical haul road leading back toward the abandoned mining district. The project was supposed to last 3 weeks. They went in with 2 bulldozers, a grader, and several heavy supply trucks. They never came out. Officially, Harold said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, it was ruled a landslide. A major collapse of the ridge, burying everything. Matt nodded. Logical. Forest work was dangerous, but they never found a single trace. Harold continued, leaning in close, his breath smelling of wintergreen and age. Not a body, not a fender, not a bolt of steel. No sign of the landslide itself, except for a stretch of ground where the road should have been. A stretch of ground that was too clean, too level. Something had just wiped the slate. As Harold described the disappearance, the sudden total erasure of 12 men and tons of heavy machinery, a strange, subtle scent permeated the air of the bar. It was a faint but distinct aroma, not of the familiar grease or beer, but of wet, very old metal that had been heated intensely. A scent like a rust-eaten iron skillet left on a roaring stove. It made the air feel thick and slightly metallic on Matt's tongue. His muscles tightened instantly, an instinctive mammalian response to an unknown threat. He tried to locate the source, checking the kitchen swinging doors, but the scent vanished as quickly as it had arrived. Harold seemed oblivious, deep in his memory. He added that the local understanding held that the territory didn't like to be disturbed, and that the woods back there takes what is owed. He spoke of the old-timers who insisted the forest was alive, not in a biological sense, but in a geographical one, that the landscape possessed a deep, slow will. To Matt, the rational cartographer, this was clear-cut rural tragedy seasoned with generations of superstitious dread. He filed it mentally as coping mechanism through mythologizing loss. The whole tale was a fascinating, sad piece of Americana, but it had no place on a professional survey map. So you think I should turn back because of an unsubstantiated story about a missing road crew? Matt asked, trying to introduce a note of dry amusement. Harold did not engage the bait. He just looked at Matt with those strange, pale eyes. No, I think you should turn back because the road you're looking for ain't a road. It's a vein. And what's in that place is blood that hasn't flowed for 70 years. Matt paid for his beer, leaving a generous tip. As he turned to leave, he felt the heavy, undeniable pressure of observation on the back of his neck. He paused in the doorway and looked back. Harold Murr stood perfectly still by the bar, framed in the yellow light, a silhouette carved out of shadow and hard lines. The old man was not moving. He was simply watching, motionless, like an ancient, weathered scarecrow placed deliberately at the edge of a field. His posture was purely anticipatory, the way a lighthouse anticipates the fog. Matt felt a knot form low in his stomach. The rational fear of getting lost or breaking an ankle had morphed into something colder, something without a name. The fear of the known world ending, displaced by a terrible, silent alternative. But the encounter did not deter him. It fueled the cold engine of his professional obsession. Matt's rational mind demanded facts to fill the vacuum of Harold's dread. His job was to map reality, and if reality was corrupted in those woods, he was obligated to document the coordinates of the flaw. He gripped the keys to his truck, the metal warm in his palm, and headed straight back to the edge of the impenetrable green wall. The path waited. Now, thanks to Harold, Matt was acutely aware that he was not just walking into the forest. He was walking onto something that watched him approach. He drove past the place where the 3 pines sat, a beacon of yellow light against the growing dusk, and felt the weight of Harold's gaze follow him until he rounded the bend. The feeling of being watched lingering like residual heat on his skin. He confirmed the drone batteries were sealed, checked the blade of his knife, and slept poorly, dreaming of spinning compasses and roads that swallowed steel. The woods had already infiltrated his mind. Matt stepped into the forest mass just as the low, humid dawn light began to filter through the canopy. The light was weak, damp, and saturated with mist rising off the forest floor. The first 2 hours were a brutal, claustrophobic struggle. The minor fox path was devoured. The earth itself had ingested the road, letting the organic matter swell and harden over the root's memory. Every yard was contested ground. Matt fought through thorny briars that clawed at his heavy canvas trousers, pushed past rotting, moss-covered logs, and slogged through viscous, sucking mud that held his boots with malevolent strength. He felt the pervasive moisture seeping into the very pores of his skin, cold and persistent. He was sweating profusely, the salt stinging his eyes. He located the original path by following the subtle depression in the topography, a ghostly indentation where countless tons of timber had once been dragged across the forest floor. After navigating a tricky section involving a steep bank and a small, completely dried-out stream bed, Matt paused for water. He checked his gear, and a small chill of professional horror went through him. The Global Positioning System, a unit he had personally calibrated and charged to 100% the night before, showed a battery life of 30%. As he watched, horrified, it flickered and dropped to 10. He immediately powered it down, conserving the remaining life. Next, the drone. He tried a short test launch, sending the lightweight quadcopter up to gain a visual on the path ahead. The drone whined pitifully and refused to ascend more than 20 feet before listing sideways and attempting to land itself. It fought an unseen, inertial resistance. His compass, the trusted brass instrument, provided the final, profound dislocation. He held it level in his palm, waiting for the needle to settle on magnetic north. Instead of steadying, the needle swung in frantic, jerky bursts, pointing wildly east then west, then settling momentarily on south before snapping back into a chaotic dance. It was frantic, electronic confusion, reflecting a violation of the physical laws governing magnetism in this specific, enclosed volume of space. Matt, the man of coordinates, felt his foundation rattle. The soundscape was equally terrifying. As he moved deeper, all the familiar noises of the deep woods vanished. The sharp chirp of the chickadees, the irritating buzz of flies, the scratchy calls of jays, all gone. All that remained was Matt's own ragged, rasping breath and a low, heavy, omnipresent thrumming sound. It was not a sound in the conventional sense. It was a pressure, a thick, low-frequency resonance that emanated not from the air, but from the dense, saturated soil beneath his boots. It was the sound of absolute, unnatural silence, a vacuum that pressed physically against his eardrums. He pressed on, following the ghost of the trail. Then he found a clear sign of the past. The collapsed remains of an old wooden bridge, rotted, splintered timbers half sunk into the boggy earth. They were covered in a thick, vibrant green moss, but beneath the decay, Matt saw the profound imprints left on the wood. Deep, wide gouges. Not the shallow tracks of light timber wagons, but the massive, purposeful impressions left by something far heavier and far older. Kneeling by the largest remaining log, Matt noticed a stagnant pool of rainwater beneath the wreckage. On the surface, a rainbow sheen coated the water. Oil. But it did not smell like modern diesel or gasoline. It smelled rancid, like mineral oil mixed with an ancient, gamey animal fat. The odor was so foul, so profoundly wrong that he recoiled, his stomach churning with revulsion. Pushing through a final curtain of thorny brush, he gained 300 yards on the bridge location. There, embedded sideways in the earth amongst the roots of 3 enormous pines, was a sign. It was made of thick, pitted cast iron, heavily rusted but undeniably solid. The lettering, deep etched in the elaborate scrolling serif typeface of the late 19th century, was still clearly legible. It read, "Foxvale 7 miles, 7 miles." Matt pulled out his remaining functional technology. He tried to reconcile the sign with the global positioning system map one final time, powering up the unit for a precious minute. In a radius of 50 miles from his current, last recorded, uncorrupted coordinates, there were no settlements. Foxvale did not exist in the modern world. It should not exist within 70 miles of his current location, let alone 7. The discovery caused a deep, paralyzing cognitive dissonance. The existence of the sign presented a choice. Either his meticulously maintained map collection, his years of specialized training, and all contemporary satellite reconnaissance were fundamentally incorrect, or the physical space he occupied was actively lying to him. The thought of an error in the system, a flaw in the known physics, sent a cold spike of something beyond fear through his chest. He wanted to return to the bar, to the light, and demand answers from Harold, to seek the sanity of asphalt and electricity. But the sign was there, solid and heavy, anchored to the physical world. 7 miles. Too close to be a historical misstatement, too real to be dismissed as an antique prank. Matt realized that the path he followed was not taking him to an abandoned location. It was leading him toward a place that had actively chosen to remove itself from the map of human affairs. The woods had swallowed the evidence, the road crew, and the town itself. Matt stood right on the edge of the mouth, breathing in the thick, wet air of its digestive tract. He felt a sudden, profound loneliness, separated from everything sensible by a wall of throbbing silence and corrupted coordinates. The challenge was now existential. He had to know what lay down those 7 impossible miles. By the middle of the second day, the path, the minor fox path, asserted itself. It was no longer a vague depression in the earth, but a discernible track, heavily shadowed but straight and purposeful. Yet, the closer Matt got to the impossible destination of Fox Vale, the more intense the creeping horror became, shifting from a subtle feeling of spatial wrongness to a stark, visual reality. The trees along the path were marked, not casually but deliberately, rhythmically. On the bark of the enormous centuries-old oaks and maples that lined the route, Matt saw deep, broad slashes. They were gouged out in pairs, running vertically down the trunk, appearing every 50 feet or so. These were not made by a woodman's axe. These marks were wide and ragged, made by something terrifyingly sharp, capable of cutting deeply and quickly into ancient, hardened wood. It was a demarcation line, a territorial boundary enforced with terrible efficiency. A few yards further, Matt stumbled upon the first truly sickening sight. Hung at the juncture of the roots of a giant maple, swinging slightly in the inert air, was the pelt of a deer. It had been flayed with absolute surgical precision. The hide was fully peeled, the meat completely removed, leaving only the skin, stretched and carefully secured to the tree not with twine or wire, but with 2 long, pale, self-made bone spikes hammered deep into the wood. The edges of the pelt were neatly folded under, giving the whole display an unnerving sense of domestic tidiness. The smell of fresh metallic blood was overwhelming, but the truly arresting quality of the scene was the sheer housekeeping of it. This was processing. This was a dedicated butcher shop. Matt knelt down, his heart hammering a rapid, frantic rhythm against his ribs. The earth beneath the maple was damp, turned over by whatever creature had performed this act. He ran his fingers over the mud. There were clear, unmistakable footprints. They were long, longer than any typical human footprint, giving the impression of someone walking perpetually on the balls of their feet, balanced and ready to spring. The base of the heel was abnormally massive, almost club-like, supporting enormous weight, and the toe phalanges were elongated, ending in powerful, blunt curves. They were the prints of a bipedal creature, one adapted for speed and violence. They were fresh. He tried desperately to categorize the evidence, seeking the logical place for a rare, unknown species or an isolated, grotesque sect of hunters. His rational fortress was under heavy siege, but he clung fiercely to the belief that this was still the natural world, however mutated or strange. He told himself, "It is not wrong. It is merely unknown." But the icy realization grew inside him. This was simply wrong. The footprints showed intelligence, purpose, and a physiology that defied human morphology. As twilight began to pool beneath the canopy, thick and blue, Matt decided to make camp, choosing a spot of relative elevation. He ate cold rations, forcing himself to chew and swallow the tasteless processed food. He checked the sky for the moon, which was just past the quarter phase, still climbing toward fullness. Darkness fell like a shroud, and the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Matt tried to sleep, wrapped in his insulated blanket, clutching the hunting knife. Then the sound came. It ripped him from the edge of sleep with the force of a physical blow. It began as a low, mournful howl, something unmistakably canine, deep in the chest. But halfway through the sound's ascent, the animal quality shattered, fracturing into a high, ragged, desperate human shriek of utter anguish and despair. It was the sound of a voice breaking on an inward breath, instantly curtailed, silenced not by the end of the air, but by the physical interruption of the cry. It was the sound of transformation, the irreversible moment of ultimate surrender. The sound resonated from every direction at once, enveloping the camp, traveling through the earth rather than the air. It was a chorus of one, and Matt felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, his body saturated with cold, visceral terror. He froze, breath held tight in his chest. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It waited, pregnant and malicious. He scanned the darkness, his eyes straining. Between the gnarled trunks of the distant trees, he saw them, two small, perfectly circular lights, resting low to the ground, yellow eyes. They were catching the minuscule ambient starlight and reflecting it back with uncanny efficiency. They did not move. They were simply there, watching. Matt reached slowly for his powerful, tactical flashlight, the cold aluminum comforting in his sweaty grip. The instant the intention to pierce the darkness registered in his brain, the yellow pinpricks of light slowly, deliberately faded out, like coals cooling in a grate. The creature or creatures perceived his intent and retreated, merging back into the blackness. They knew he was there. They were aware. Matt spent the rest of the night rigid, listening to the heavy, pulsing silence. He did not dare move. Just before dawn, when the darkness reached its deepest saturation, a new sensation broke the tension. A smell. It was faint, carried on a barely perceptible movement of air, but it was definite. Smoke. A thin, straight column of gray wood smoke, mixed with the unmistakable, slightly sweet aroma of frying meat and yeast bread. It meant fire. It meant warmth. It meant, irrefutably, people. The terror of the night was replaced by a surge of desperate, hopeful adrenaline. Matt packed his few remaining items in frantic haste, ignoring the dull ache in his chest and the lingering metallic scent in the air. The existence of smoke, of cooking, meant the existence of civilization. Even if it was a civilization that used bone spikes and howled like a soul being torn from its shell. He moved quickly toward the smell, driven by the need to confront the known, no matter how hideous, rather than endure the unknown of the silent, watching dark. Foxvale was waiting. Matt pushed through a final thicket of scratchy cedar. The transition was abrupt. One moment he wrestled with the dense, wet undergrowth, and the next he stepped onto the boundary of a distinct, impeccably manicured clearing. Before him lay the village of Foxvale. It was composed of perhaps 20 structures, arranged in a neat, severe grid around a central square. The architecture was classic northeastern mining vernacular, built from thick lumber, functional and squat, precisely dating to the mid-1940s. The unsettling thing was not their age, but their condition. The buildings were in perfect stasis. Fresh paint coated the siding, a dull, period-appropriate green and brown. The window glass was intact, reflecting the weak morning light. Porches were swept clean. It was a town preserved in amber, an exhibit in a museum where time had stopped. The anachronism was jarring. Parked neatly by the wide dirt road were several ancient pickup trucks, Fords and Chevrolets, perhaps 1947 models. They were immaculate. There was no rust, no peeling paint, no chipped glass. They looked as if they had just rolled off the assembly line yesterday, smelling faintly of new tires and hot lacquer. The general store, a sturdy clapboard building at the center of the square, bore a hand-painted sign: Foxvale, coal, timber, general supplies. The air still carried the faint, delicious promise of cooking, fried animal fat and the sweet, yeasty scent of rising bread mixed with the sharp, clean smell of burning wood. Everything spoke of recent, meticulous life, yet the street was utterly, profoundly dead. There were no people, no washing on the lines, no children's toys in the dirt, no sounds other than the slight, almost imperceptible whistle of wind through the power lines, lines that should not have been functional. Matt approached the nearest house, a modest two-bedroom bungalow with a freshly painted green trim. Smoke drifted lazily from the stovepipe chimney. A clay pot of vibrant red geraniums sat blooming on the windowsill. The door was unlocked. He pushed the door inward, the hinges emitting a low, oiled groan. Inside, the light was warm, cast by exposed filament bulbs that hummed faintly in their sockets. A meal sat waiting on the small kitchen table. Heavy ceramic plates piled high with mashed potatoes, thick gravy, and several slices of slow-cooked pork roast. The food was cool to the touch, but it had not spoiled. It retained the warm, savory aroma of recent preparation. Time, Matt realized, was not only warped out in the woods, it was behaving erratically here too. The lamps were lit, the food was prepared, but no one had been here for hours, perhaps days, and yet nothing had deteriorated. In the living room, a heavy, moth-eaten armchair was positioned next to a small side table. On the table lay a book, open and face down. Matt carefully picked it up. It was a thick, old King James Bible. He noted the page it was open to, page 66. He felt the cold touch of institutional archival horror, the specific terror of frozen history. He walked to the front window, moving cautiously, trying to remain undetected in this museum of the forgotten. Peeking out between the freshly starched lace curtains, he saw them. The dogs. 7 or 8 hounds, large, gaunt, and deep-chested, sat in the middle of the dirt road, positioned in a wide arc around the house Matt was in. They were silent. They were not barking, growling, or sniffing the ground. They were simply sitting, utterly motionless, their heads uniformly turned toward the bungalow. Their eyes, large and entirely black, were fixed on the house, watching Matt with an intense, unblinking stillness that suggested patience beyond the canine. They were silent observers, positioned like sentries. He quickly backed away from the window. The stillness of the dogs was more terrifying than a pack of snarling beasts. They were not panicked. They waited for instruction. His breath catching in his throat, Matt hurried to the cabinet in the living room, searching for clues, some record of the town's existence. He found a stack of newspapers. The top one, dated in bold black ink, read, October 12, 1953. The headline screamed in thick block letters, Foxvale miners go missing. Official search ceases. The last human date. The year of the erasure. Matt grabbed a few items. A small tin of matches, a heavy chipped ceramic coffee mug. Anything tangible from this impossible place. He looked back at the cold, preserved meal, the flickering bulbs, the perfect stasis. This was not a ghost town. This was a stage set, ready for actors who had simply paused mid-scene. He spent perhaps 15 minutes inside the unnaturally quiet house, gathering his composure. When he finally slipped back out onto the porch, moving with painstaking stealth, he stopped dead, his lungs seizing in his chest. The dry, fine dust of the Foxvale Road retained footprints clearly. When he had entered the house, he had left his own distinct boot tracks on the threshold. Now, those tracks were crossed out. Overlaid on his own familiar, rational prints were new, disturbingly fresh impressions. The long, tapered tracks he had seen by the flayed deer. The heavy, elongated prints with the massive heels and splayed, powerful toes. The track showed where the creature had paused right at the edge of the porch, directly in front of the door, while Matt had been inside reading the 1953 headlines. It had not scratched, not knocked, not barked. It had simply approached his entry point, waited silently, and then, judging by the tracks leading off toward the general store, moved on. They knew he was here. They had been in the village, moving with terrifying silence, even as he surveyed their abandoned houses. Foxvale was not an abandoned museum. It was a hunting blind. Matt Hargreaves, the cartographer, had just walked right into the kill zone. Matt chose the general store as his sanctuary. It was the largest structure in Foxvale, built of thick, load-bearing timber and fieldstone, offering the greatest sense of permanence. He smashed the front display case to retrieve a couple of rusted, heavy logging chains, useless as weapons, but satisfyingly heavy, and used them to jam the thick wooden door shut. He could feel the sun dragging itself slowly down behind the oppressive, interlocking canopy of the surrounding woods. The light faded not in degrees, but in sharp, measurable cuts. As the last traces of illumination vanished, the atmosphere congealed. It felt like the shift from water to thick oil. The village did not wake up with noise. It activated under the pressure of the dark. There was no sound of generators, no flicker of streetlights, just an escalating quiet friction. The air quality changed immediately. A profound metallic stink began to seep into the store, overcoming the faint, preserved aroma of dried tobacco and aged flour. It was the smell of fresh, warm iron, like wet steel that had been recently polished. Concurrently, the temperature inside the store plummeted. It was a cold that cut deeper than the natural night air, a chill that emanated from the very earth, unnatural and bone-aching. Then came the sound. It originated right outside the massive oak front door, a scratching. Slow, deliberate, and deep. It was a powerful rhythmic scoring, as if enormous specialized talons were being slowly drawn across the dense old wood. Scree, scree, scree. Each sound was deep enough that Matt felt the vibration through the floorboards and into the soles of his boots. The scratching lasted perhaps a minute, no more. It was a test, a deliberate announcement. When it ceased, the ensuing silence pulsed in Matt's ears, amplified by the terror screaming inside his own skull. He retreated behind the heavy wooden service counter, his back pressed against the shelves filled with dusty pre-war canned goods. They are not bears. They are not coons, he thought, his internal monologue a frantic, broken thing. It is not a random animal act. Something waited. It stood upright, yet moved on four limbs. It listened with an uncanny, silent concentration. It breathed the rank air. Matt's carefully constructed rationalism had dissolved completely. He was left with only the raw, electric awareness of a hunted animal. He held the hunting knife tight, his knuckle bones white, the adrenaline burning a chemical fire in his bloodstream. He felt the proximity of the threat, a heavy, invisible weight beyond the wooden wall. He waited an hour, maybe two, in the absolute lightless dark. Finally, cautiously, moving with the slow, almost fluid motion of a snake, he crept toward the narrow, dusty window facing the street. He pulled back the stiff, yellowed curtain a single inch. The moon chose that moment to punch through a thick layer of clouds, flooding the village square with a stark, cold, silver light. He saw the figures. There were many of them. They moved, not with the languid posture of people, but in a swift, crouching semi-crouch, utilizing both hands and feet to gain ground. Their gait was low and powerful, a mixture of sprinting and crawling. They flowed through the shadows between the buildings, silent and purposeful. One figure paused directly beneath the hanging sign of the general store, perhaps 20 feet away. It raised its head, turning its face toward the moonlight. He did not see the features of the head clearly, obscured by the angle and shadow, but he saw the back. It was covered in thick, uneven patches of dark, wiry fur, growing in random stiff clumps, like dark moss on pale stone. The skin visible between the patches, where the transformation was incomplete, was a shocking, sickly white, like the underside of a fish. The figure's musculature was impossibly dense, outlining thick shoulders and a bowed spine that suggested immense weight and power supported on 4 points. They were people. People who had been warped, folded back upon themselves, becoming something else entirely. Creatures of rapid movement and cold, unnatural flesh. The Foxvale residents did not disappear, Matt realized with paralyzing clarity. They just stayed on their land, and the land changed them. Matt knew he could not fight them, not with a hunting knife against that coordinated, silent speed. To stay here was to wait for the door to inevitably be breached, to become the next flayed offering. He had to run. He had to get out before the cold certainty of the woods claimed his body as irrevocably as it had claimed his map. He began desperately searching for a back exit, a window, any way to break the suffocating siege of the quiet, watching night. The sound of the scratching, Matt realized, was not a threat. It was a roll call, a check to confirm he was still on the manifest. The first glimmer of dawn, a sickly, diluted gray that fought weakly against the forest's darkness, began to pull the shadows back. Matt, having found and managed to unbar a heavy rear window overlooking a small enclosed yard filled with rusted barrels, was preparing to flee when he heard a slow, deliberate tapping on the front door. It was not the frantic scratching of the night. It was the careful rap of a human knuckle. He froze, knife held high. "It's open, Matt Hargreaves," a dry voice called from the front. I left the pin off the latch. Slowly, reluctantly, Matt returned to the front of the store. Standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the weak morning light, was a man. He was tall, gaunt, and severely old, with a dense shock of white hair and deep lines etched into his face like old canyons. He wore battered canvas overalls and a thick flannel shirt, holding an antique double-barreled shotgun loosely in one hand. He introduced himself as Abel. He smelled of smoke, fresh, fragrant hardwood smoke, mixed with the sharp, clean scent of ozone and something subtly, unnervingly like old, slightly spoiled meat. Abel showed no surprise at finding Matt barricaded and panicked. His voice was slow, rich with the inflections of a mountain preacher, utterly devoid of fear or urgency. Who I am doesn't matter much now. What matters is them. He nodded toward the dense, quiet forest line. They are not creatures of folklore, Matt. No magic, no demons. They are simply what happens when you decide to stay in the wrong place for too long, when the civilization pulls back its maps and its rules. Abel's explanation was chilling precisely because it lacked mystery. He spoke of the villagers, the original Foxvale inhabitants, who had lost their connection to the wider world when the mines closed and the old timber routes were abandoned. They had become economically, geographically isolated. Over decades, the forest provided for them, protecting them from the outside world while simultaneously demanding a price for that protection. The wood doesn't hunt, Matt. It adapts, Abel explained, walking slowly down an aisle of canned vegetables dated 1952. It filters. It doesn't want the civilization brought back in. So, it changes what is already here. It makes them strong, quiet, able to move through the deepest dark, able to eat what the forest provides. It's a geographical, biological process, sped up by isolation. They stayed on this land, and they became the land. The horror, Matt realized, was that this was cold, hard logic. Not a supernatural curse, but an ecological finality. If you penetrate deep enough into the true, unfiltered wilderness, the human operating system fails, and a primal software takes over. Abel confirmed that the minor fox path Matt followed was not a road, but a boundary, a biological filter. It let people in, those seeking silence, or those disrupting the silence, but it actively opposed their exit. The forest was digesting its catch. You brought the outside world in with you, Matt. The electronics, the science, the insistence on boundaries. The woods don't like definition. It wants flow. You either flow with it or you break, Abel said, his voice flat. In that moment of concentrated observation, Matt finally focused on Abel's hands. The nails were long, yellowed, and terribly thick, curved like the talons of a large bird of prey, but too wide, fused to the ends of the fingers. Then Abel turned his head slightly to glance at the rising sun filtering through the high window. Matt saw his eyes. They were a deep, reflective gold, and the pupil was not the soft, black circle of a man. It was a thin, perfect vertical slit, contracting fiercely in the strengthening light. The eye of a pure, nocturnal predator. Abel was not merely a witness to the village's transformation. He was one of its most integrated elements. Abel, sensing Matt's realization, smiled. A slight dry movement of the lips that did not touch the eyes. "We don't need to hurt you now," Abel said, picking up his shotgun and resting the butt on the floor. "The moon is still 3 days from full. You have that time, Matt. 3 days to find your own exit, a way the path hasn't foreseen, or to accept what Foxvale offers. If you stay." Abel paused, looking Matt directly in the eyes with those dreadful slits. "You'll stay here, inhabiting a body you will no longer recognize as your own. That is the way of the woods." Abel turned and walked out the front door, leaving the massive shotgun behind. He did not look back. He simply stepped into the shadows and was gone, dissolving into the quiet morning air. Matt stood there, holding the cold steel of his knife, staring at the old, abandoned shotgun. Abel had not issued a threat. He had delivered a geological forecast. The horror was complete. It was logical, it was geographical, and it was now personally imminent. He had been accepted into the system of the forest, and the clock was ticking down to his biological reclassification. Abel's explanation, cold and rational as it was, confirmed the absolute necessity of immediate flight. Matt knew the concept of full moon was merely a symbolic deadline for a biological transition already underway. He could not risk the change. His one remaining advantage was his technology, however degraded. He retrieved the drone and powered it up for a final, desperate reconnaissance. He needed to find a structural break in the forest's perimeter, a route out that the major fox path, now patrolled by Abel and his ilk, did not anticipate. The drone lifted off reluctantly, whining against the heavy air. The digital feed on the controller screen was severely distorted, as though Matt was looking through a layer of thick, churning water. He managed to force the drone high enough to gain a wide view. What he saw was terrible but undeniable. The forest surrounding Foxvale was not just dense, it was wrong. The trees leaned inward, creating a domed structure. From this height, he saw movement. Dozens of figures, not moving randomly, but with silent, synchronized purpose. They patrolled the perimeter, not chasing him, but maintaining a perfectly closed circle. They formed a living, breathing barrier. The drone, fighting the constant electromagnetic drag, suddenly tumbled and fell, the screen showing only static before crashing somewhere deep in the impenetrable timber line. Matt did not wait to recover the equipment. He grabbed his pack and ran. He chose the direction opposite his entry point, smashing through the heavy rear fence line of Foxvale, driven by a pure animal panic. He ran, ignoring the tearing vines and the sharp breath that tasted of blood in his lungs. He wanted the coordinates of civilization. He wanted the safe, verifiable reality of the outside world. He sprinted for perhaps 20 minutes, fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying memory of those vertical golden pupils. He did not stop to check his direction, running solely on the instinct of opposition, fighting against the dense, wet mass of the woods. He stopped, utterly winded, leaning against a massive weeping cedar, forcing air into his tortured lungs. He turned, bracing himself for the sight of pursuit, the silent, terrible speed he knew they possessed. Nothing. Absolute silence. His new, horrifyingly acute sense of smell, however, registered them. A faint, oily scent, sweat, earth, and fresh, unadulterated raw meat was on the air, very close. They were not chasing him fast. They were simply moving with him, effortlessly keeping pace, always just out of sight. They waited for him to tire, for the map inside his head to fail completely. He stumbled onward, slower now, pushing through the thick, overgrown terrain. He moved for what felt like hours, constantly checking his flanks, the pressure of unseen eyes heavy upon him. Then, in a sudden, sickening moment of recognition, Matt's legs gave out, dropping him onto the damp forest floor. He looked up, breathing hard, heart hammering against his ribs. Before him lay the broken, moss-covered remains of a wooden bridge. The same collapsed timbers he had crossed 2 days before, the site of the rancid oil slick. He recognized the specific slant of the fallen logs, the unique way the green moss had colonized the wood. He crawled across the collapsed bridge, utterly defeated, the realization of the trap settling over him like a stone coffin lid. He had run for what he estimated was 3 or 4 hard miles, entirely in the opposite direction from Foxvale. And there, leaning drunkenly amongst the roots on the other side of the bridge, exactly where he had seen it before, was the sign. The thick, pitted cast iron, engraved in the severe script of the 1800s, Foxvale 7 miles. He had run a massive, frantic, pointless circle. The distance marker, Matt understood with terrifying certainty, was not a static piece of history. It was a statement of proximity maintained by the forest itself. The woods was not a place in linear space. It was a Mobius strip of geography. It actively warped the physical space around Foxvale, ensuring that no matter which direction he traveled, he would always be circling the village, 7 miles away from its magnetic center. He collapsed entirely beneath the bridge, burying his face in the cool, damp earth, fighting back a wave of hysterical, high-pitched laughter. His rational world, built on Euclidean geometry, was utterly, brutally destroyed. He remained there, hiding under the timbers, listening. The silence was complete. They had not needed to catch him. They had not needed to exert themselves at all. The forest held him, the boundaries of space bent by a silent, immense will. They knew he would circle back. He was wet with sweat, shivering with cold, and overwhelmingly fatigued. The silent hunters surrounding him felt no such exhaustion. They were merely waiting for the biological clock of the full moon to run its course. Matt spent the rest of the day and the ensuing night huddled beneath the collapsed bridge, operating on the ragged edges of consciousness and terror. He did not sleep. He merely experienced a heightened low-level state of shock, punctuated by the cold, deep silence. Then, just as the sun began to warm the canopy the next morning, a weak, hesitant light, Matt heard the unmistakable sound of a combustion engine. It was old, rough, and distinctly civilized. He crawled out from under the wreckage, squinting in the dim light. Pulled up abruptly at the bridge's edge, where the path should have been impassable, was a familiar sight. An ancient, mud-spattered green pickup truck, the make and model so old it could have been contemporary with the vehicles in Foxvale. But this one was dented, dirty, and utterly real. Leaning against the driver's door, looking utterly ordinary, was Harold Murr, the old ranger from the Three Pines Tavern. Harold looked exhausted, his face grimed with dirt and stubble. But he was entirely normal. He wore a heavy plaid shirt and had a battered rifle rack mounted in the truck's rear window. He looked like an anchor dropped into the middle of the surreal chaos. "I knew you'd go in," Harold said, his voice rusty but steady. He walked toward Matt, carrying a heavy metal canteen. "Been looking for you since the day before yesterday." Matt took the offered canteen, gulping the cool water greedily. "The day before yesterday? I've been in here 2 nights. 3 days, Harold. I saw them. The town. The people." Harold simply nodded, avoiding Matt's frantic gaze. "Doesn't matter what you saw. What matters is the time outside. The clock's different in there. The official search for you started yesterday morning. They think you just got lost hiking." Matt checked his global positioning system log. Miraculously, the unit had regained some functionality since the drone crash. The internal clock, which was always linked to the satellite feed, recorded only 6 hours since he had started the first recorded run. For Matt, 2 nights of bone-chilling terror and 3 days of running had collapsed into a fraction of a day for the outside world. The realization hit him. The forest had not just hidden Foxvale, it had stolen Matt's time. The scent of Harold, a strong smell of sweet pipe tobacco, sweat and motor oil, was overwhelming, a potent, intoxicating aroma of reality and safety. Matt clung to the scent, forcing himself to speak, describing the village, the figures, the strange, silent dogs, and the logical horror of Abel's philosophy. Harold listened without interruption, nodding slowly, occasionally spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the mossy earth. He did not express surprise, shock, or disbelief. He listened with the quiet authority of someone who had heard this story before. "We need to move fast," Harold said when Matt finished his disjointed narrative. "There are trails, not the path, but older ways. Ways the woods hasn't bothered to map yet." They moved quickly. Harold was unnervingly adept at navigating the chaos. He did not use a compass or a map. He moved by smell and subtle changes in the forest floor, avoiding the thickest concentrations of timber. Matt, following his lead, felt the environment gradually change. The thick, silent pressure began to abate. The sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small animals, the noise of an actual, functioning ecology slowly returned. Reality was bleeding back into the vacuum. Finally, they reached the tree line that bordered the state highway, the dividing line between the national park and the maintained county road. Matt saw his own truck, still parked where he had left it, looking ridiculously exposed and small. They stopped at the edge of the woods. Harold did not look at Matt. He kept his eyes fixed on the line of timber behind them. "You shouldn't have seen them, Matt," Harold whispered, his voice dry and low. "Nobody should. The woods doesn't mind giving up its history, but it doesn't like having its current secrets carried out into the light." Matt, overwhelmed by the sudden return to safety, did not press the question. He merely thanked Harold profusely, promising to call, to buy him a drink, to explain everything when he had processed it. He climbed into his sport utility vehicle, the plastic of the steering wheel, the hum of the air conditioner, the faint scent of stale gasoline, all sensations of pure civilization washing over him. He started the engine, shifting into drive. In the rearview mirror, as he began to roll forward, Matt saw Harold Murr standing perfectly still at the tree line. The old man raised his head slowly, watching the vehicle. The late morning sun, stronger now that they were out of the deep canopy, struck Harold full in the face. Matt saw it, clear, horrifying, undeniable. Harold's pupils were not the dull gray of the old man he knew from the bar. They were long, shimmering slits, the color of heated bronze, reflecting the harsh sunlight with terrifying efficiency. The eyes of a hunter. The realization struck Matt with the force of a physical impact. Harold had not rescued him from the woods. Harold was a part of its mechanism. He had not been saved from the trap. He had simply been released on a long, loose leash. Harold had guided him out of the main complex, away from the immediate threat of Foxvale, confirming that Matt was intact and ready to return to the world of men. For now. Matt slammed his foot on the accelerator, tearing onto the highway, not daring to look in the mirror again, driving until the thick, towering mass of the woods was nothing more than a green smudge behind him. The horror was now mobile, and it was sitting in the driver's seat. Matt Hargreaves returned to his rented house outside Millbrook. He was physically intact, his clothes torn, his body bruised and exhausted, but outwardly whole. Internally, he was irrevocably fractured, a man who had seen the gears of the world turn backward and had been registered as a flaw in the system. Within 3 days, the symptoms began. Sleep became impossible. Every subtle sound in the old wooden house, the groan of the foundations settling, the hiss of the pipes, the gentle friction of the insulation shifting, was amplified into a deafening roar. The ordinary silence of the suburbs felt like the same pressing vacuum he had experienced in the deeper woods, only now corrupted by civilization's tiny, ceaseless ticks and hums. His sense of smell had become unbearable. The smell of his own coffee was acrid and artificial. The faintest whiff of neighbors' garbage, a mixture of spoiled milk and vegetable decay, was so rank he felt constant waves of nausea. He smelled the ozone rising off the power transformers down the block and the thin, sharp scent of antifreeze leaking from a car parked 300 yards away. It was sensory overload, a primal, animal awakening that rejected the soft, processed environment of human life. He could not eat cooked food. The flavor was muted, lifeless, tasteless. He tried a rare steak, but the heat destroyed all nutritional promise. He found himself standing in front of the refrigerator, staring intently at packages of raw ground beef. A thick, desperate saliva building in his mouth. The urge was disgusting, profound, and utterly non-negotiable. A deep, visceral craving for warm, raw meat. It pressed upon him like a heavy, cold hunger that could never be truly satisfied by cooking. One morning, he woke up in his perfectly clean bed and found dark, rusty streaks of dried forest mud coating his forearms and neck. He had no memory of leaving the house, no memory of opening the locked door. He frantically checked the clock and the date. Time had not shifted. He had been gone for less than an hour. He had walked into the nearby patch of small municipal woods, bordering the creek, moving in his sleep, drawn by an instinct he did not control. The human part of him slept. The forest self prowled. His emotional landscape had devolved into sharp, unmanageable reflexes. The ring of the telephone, the arbitrary, demanding electronic noise, triggered an immediate, blinding flash of rage, a desperate urge to smash the instrument. He began to move differently in his own home. He stopped walking heel to toe. He padded, low and silently, pressing the outside edge of his foot onto the floorboards, head perpetually slightly bent, listening to the darkness. His back began to ache constantly, a deep structural pain, the result of muscles adapting to a low-slung, perpetually ready posture. The technology that was his anchor, his global positioning system unit, his laptop, his smartphone, all began to fail spectacularly in his presence. Screens froze, signals dropped, and batteries drained with unnatural speed. The devices that represented ordered civilization refused to function near the chaos he had internalized. The logic was clear. He carried the environment of Foxvale with him, and that environment was toxic to electronic order. The internal battle was exhausting. The old Matt, the cartographer obsessed with coordinates and boundaries, was retreating, losing ground to a terrifying simplicity. His internal space was simultaneously empty of thought and full of instinct. Hunt, hide, silence, run. He knew the time of the full moon was fast approaching. He was in the final stages of the transition Abel had predicted. He was becoming a resident, the system finalizing his registration. In a last, desperate attempt to confirm his dwindling humanity, Matt walked into the bathroom, flipped on the harsh overhead light, and stared into the mirror. He waited, fighting the urge to shatter the reflective surface. He directed his powerful tactical flashlight directly into his own face. He stared at his eyes, looking for the impossible. They looked normal. The whites clear, the iris a familiar, tired blue. But deep within the pupils, past the blackness, just before the light hit the retina, he saw a fleeting reflection. A single, distinct pinprick of gold. It was a reflection from something deeper, something coiled and waiting, ready to unspool the vertical slit in the dark. It was the eye of the predator, temporarily masked by the human facade, waiting patiently for the final authority of the night. He turned off the flashlight and sat on the edge of the tub, breathing slowly, accepting the bitter truth. The woods had not only let him go, it had planted its seed deep inside his geometry, and now it was growing. He was a walking vector of the wrong physics, doomed to return to the place that now contained his true, silent nature. 2 weeks had passed since Matt's return, 2 weeks characterized by sleepless nights, raw meat cravings, and the incessant, maddening static of technology struggling to survive his proximity. He had reached a state of terrible clarity. The human part of him, the rational self, was making its final, methodical stand, trying to understand the horror through the tools of its trade. He forced himself to sit down at his decommissioned workstation. He had to analyze the remaining data before the last of his equipment failed entirely. He started with the Global Positioning System log from his frantic flight. He managed to isolate the 6 hours of recorded coordinates that had, for him, felt like 3 days. The resulting map was a graphic representation of madness. The plot showed a chaotic, spaghetti-like tangle of points that defied physical distance. In a supposedly two-dimensional plane, he had traveled 1 mile north, then suddenly recorded a point 2 miles south, only to return to the north within 5 minutes. The path was a localized field of gravitational distortion, where distance was subjective. The woods was a sovereign space, operating under its own perverse logic. Next, he managed to hack into his old departmental server, leveraging his residual security clearances to access high-resolution satellite imagery taken in 2023. He layered the modern aerials onto his 100-year-old survey map. At first, the central mass of the forest was, as expected, a uniform blank green. Then, he adjusted the thermal and spectral filters, pushing the imagery beyond standard visible light. Slowly, agonizingly, the truth emerged. In the absolute center of the blank green square, a tiny, almost subliminal grouping of heat signatures appeared, clustered in a rectangular grid. Foxvale. It was not visible to the naked eye, hidden by layers of dense, self-reinforcing canopy. But it was physically there. A few dozen dots of slightly elevated temperature in the vast coldness. Matt zoomed in, pushing the satellite software to its limit. Beneath the faint cluster of points, he found a tag. Not a standard official United States Geological Survey tag, but a small, persistent data overlay, written in an antique, simplified typeface, resistant to all the modern filters. It read, starkly, Foxvale. His heart began to pound a rhythm of absolute final fear. He requested a deeper dive into the historical records using his old contacts. He asked specifically about any census or relocation data for the area between the two towns. The response came back through an encrypted channel within the hour, brief and chilling. The settlement of Foxvale did not exist in the current public registry. But in the confidential records for the 1953 census, a single handwritten note appended to the file for the entire region read, "Foxvale, relocated." They had not vanished. They had not died in a landslide. They had moved. Not geographically, but legally and existentially, withdrawing their presence from the grid of civilization, relocating themselves into the geography of the forest's sovereignty. They had signed themselves out of human time. Matt stared at the glowing screen, the cold logic burning away the last vestiges of his hope. The horror was not supernatural. It was bureaucratic. The forest possessed its own jurisdiction, a space where physics bent to accommodate its inhabitants. His final piece of data came from the crashed drone. Miraculously, the memory card was intact. He recovered the files, mostly corrupted imagery, but deep within the metadata, where the drone's internal mapping software logged its location, he found a small, hidden text file. It was a digital annotation, stamped with the exact time of the crash. He opened the file. The screen glowed with the stark, unfeeling language of technology. A single declarative statement entered into the system by some unknown mechanism, instantly recognizing his place in the environment. The text read, "Foxvale. Resident, M. Hargreaves." Matt closed his eyes. The realization was the final, devastating blow. He had gone into the woods seeking to fix a cartographical error, to place a lost town back onto the map. Instead, the town, the system, had mapped him. He was no longer a visitor, or even a victim. He had been accepted, logged and registered by the non-human logic of the woods. His pursuit of rational truth had resulted in his own condemnation. His map had become his death warrant, a final, chilling statement of acceptance into the transformation. The last sliver of the old Matt, the man of paper and lines, crumbled away, replaced by the profound, cold certainty of his new identity. 2 weeks had curdled into 3. Matt no longer fought the change. The constant tension in his muscles, the heightened senses, the hunger, they were necessities of a new, simplified existence. His first act of ultimate surrender was the systematic destruction of his old life. He took a rock and smashed his global positioning system unit, the screen dying in a silent electronic gasp. He removed the battery from his satellite phone and crushed the circuit board with the heel of his boot. The vast stacks of paper maps that had been his only comfort were carried, one by one, into the backyard and fed into a galvanized incinerator barrel. The sight of the precise lines and careful measurements curling, blistering, and turning to ash provided a strange, satisfying relief. He kept only one document, the century-old topographic sheet, the one with the original faint, dotted line of the minor fox path. Now that line pulsed with cold, undeniable truth. His walk had irrevocably changed. He no longer strode, he moved. His pace was low, fluid, and silent. The weight shifted entirely onto the balls of his feet. He could cross his wooden floor at midnight without a creak. The constant, deep ache in his spine and shoulders had subsided, replaced by a flexible, coiled tension, the physiological adaptation to low-profile running. The hunger was now a relentless, motivating force. His saliva was thick, tasting perpetually of metal. He no longer thought of food. He thought of prey. The civilized vocabulary of diet had been replaced by the brutal, direct language of the hunt. The silence of the woods, which had terrified him, now offered him profound, deep comfort. He hated the abrasive clamor of human life, the distant drone of machinery, the careless, loud quality of human voices. He craved the heavy, damp coolness of the dark and the profound, absolute muteness of the deep timber. This was his new sanctuary, his only peace. On the night of the nearly full moon, a silver disk climbing high and cold above the suburbs, Matt knew his time had run out. The internal golden reflection he saw in the dark was now dominant, and the human voice in his mind was a distant, dying echo. He left his house just before midnight. He did not take a backpack, or water, or a blanket. He only took the cold steel hunting knife, which had become an organic extension of his arm, and the single crisp sheet of the old map, folded and tucked into his pocket, not for direction, but as a final relic. He looked back at Millbrook. The streetlights cast their sickly yellow pools onto the asphalt, lighting up the ignorant, self-satisfied tranquility of the sleeping town. He saw the cars parked neatly, the cable boxes humming, the blinds drawn tight against the outside world. He felt an overwhelming wave of cold revulsion. They were soft. They were blind. They were doomed. He turned toward the edge of the county. He did not need the map now. He felt the direction pulling him, an inexorable magnetic attraction, guided not by satellite coordinates, but by the smell of wet earth, pine resin, and the metallic tang of the wood's cold authority. He was not walking to the village. He was walking to the woods, returning to the entity that claimed him. He glanced back one last time at the window of his own home. In the dark glass, his reflection was barely visible, low to the ground, shoulders slumped, head tucked. Not the upright silhouette of a man, but the crouched, ready posture of a creature. Matt reached the broken patch of asphalt where his journey had begun weeks before. He found the opening in the trees easily. The minor fox path was no longer obscured. It was clear, trodden earth, a fresh, intentional line cutting into the darkness, maintained and ready for its newest resident. He stepped under the massive, interlocking boughs of the canopy. The instant his feet pressed onto the forest floor, the sound of the town, the distant hum of traffic, the low electronic buzz of the power grid vanished entirely. The surrounding air went utterly silent, thick and cold. The last of Matt Hargreaves, the cartographer, died there, extinguished by the profound, welcoming silence. He had become part of the great eternal mechanism of the forest. He knew the path intimately, and now the path knew him. He walked forward, disappearing into the absolute dark, registering his name in the soil beneath his heavy, powerful feet.